chair. My name is Tom. I'm from Loyola. Looking forward to this debate. Thank you very much for sticking around, and obviously congratulations to Claremont, UCLA, and Santa Monica for your exceptional work.
Could you read the motion aloud for the camera?
I will read the motion one more time.
Thank you.
This House believes that existing welfare programs should be replaced by unconditional cash transfers. Now, I would like to invite the Prime Minister to open today's debate with a speech not in excess of 7 minutes. Here he is.
You really learn a lot when you work with those in society who do not afford the same luxuries that you are born into when you are from an upper middle class household. It is because we believe that inequality has little place in today's society, and that we ought to urge a ballot for equity in society, one that treats all members fairly, that we are proud to propose in today's motion. Now, recently, while working with those who are less fortunate, I worked at UCLA recently while I was a prospective student there with the homeless outreach. And, yes, UCLA is wonderful. I'm totally sucking up to you guys. So when working with the homeless industry, we met a man named Mike. Now, Mike had, as a 20-something-year-old guy, had gotten in trouble with the law enforcement for drugs. And now he was homeless. The problem with Mike is that offense occurred 20 years in his past. And unfortunately, he was ineligible for government-funded welfare because of a mistake that he made. The punishment clearly does not match the crime. Yet a society of inequality and unequal treatment and conditional welfare has made this man's life a living hell. Because of a mistake made so long ago, the punishment does not match the crime, and we see a society that allows and in fact invites cyclical poverty. So what we want to do in today's debate round is first look at the lens for how we analyze this motion. We analyze this motion through a lens of social progress, specifically on eliminating poverty. We take a look at current existing welfare programs enacted by President Johnson in the 1960s, and we have to analyze what their original purpose was. President Johnson talked about how he was fighting a war on poverty, and we believe that when evaluating policies such as current existing welfare programs, that we ought to examine them against what they set out to do. So that said, let's take a look at what is the status quo. The status quo right now is contingent upon certain standards, like you have to pass a drug test. You have to be either unemployed for a certain number of years and that those benefits expire after a certain amount of time. And you can't be on welfare for more than a few years thanks to Reagan-era policies. We believe that such amendments to welfare programs that exist today have undermined the functionality of American welfare programs. Which is why we're going to, first of all, look at this House as a context of the United States. Sidebar, if you'd like to talk about other examples, you're more than welcome to do so. But we're going to focus our 7 minutes primarily on the United States after the model. So we're going to take a look at the model in today's debate round. This House should replace conditional welfare programs with unconditional subsidies. And that's about as straightforward as it gets. So what we mean when we say we replace current welfare programs with unconditional subsidies, it means that if the government deems that you are eligible for welfare, that they can't take that away from you. Like that decision is final. Like it's not determined on whether or not you're seeking employment. It's not determined on whether or not you pass or fail a drug test. It's about whether or not you are eligible for that aid, and that is about as unconditional as it gets. But your point being.
So you told us that Mike doesn't get welfare and that was a problem because he committed a crime 20 years ago, but then you went on to tell us that conditional welfare is his problem. Does he get welfare at all, and is your problem with the fact that he doesn't, or is it with the fact that he does get it and it's conditional?
Oh, perhaps I wasn't being clear. He doesn't get welfare, and that's why he's homeless. Like, the whole point is that because of a crime he committed 20 years ago, like, he has a criminal history, and that precludes him from receiving welfare from the government. And we believe that that preclusion ultimately does more harm than good. Like, the punishment should match the crime. In Mike's case, he did his sentence, and he ultimately has faced problems for what he's done, and that's not morally justified. So that said, we're going to take a look at 3 reasons for why we believe that conditional welfare is inadvisable policy and ought to be replaced by an unconditional subsidy. So let's take a look at that first point that we're going to bring up, that conditional welfare is inadvisable policy. Now, when we examine welfare, when we examine any policy, whether it be about criminal justice, about economics, we ought to compare it against what it set out to do and how successful it has been in accomplishing that goal. So we can look to President Johnson's quote and assess the success or failure of current poverty laws today. But homeless Mike is not the only person who has suffered under existing laws. Taken from the State of World Atlas in 2012, we see that 27% of U.S. households have reported that they have difficulty in feeding their families. Current welfare policies are ultimately discriminatory against minority groups, and this is ultimately bad because we're failing at the job of eliminating poverty. We also see that we have vast income inequality in the United States, where 40% of U.S. wealth is controlled by the top 1% of society. See, when people who can alleviate poverty, it's much like if you see a person drowning, you're obligated to save them. Like if you see someone who is in trouble, you are obligated to help them if you can. And in this case, we have people who have the ability to alleviate poverty, and we believe that there's an obligation to do so. So what this means is because current conditional welfare has not accomplished what it sets out to do, we believe that it ought to be replaced and upgraded. So let's take a look at how, under your second point, about how the government has an obligation to promote equity. Now, obviously people are born into unequal households. Like, I did nothing to morally deserve being born into an upper middle class household, whereas someone who's born into a house below the poverty line didn't do anything to deserve that outcome either. Like, you don't pass a test that says, congratulations, you are going to be born to Bill and Melinda Gates, or congratulations, you get to be born to a couple that had you in prison. Like, there's nothing that you did morally to deserve what happens. But that has a huge impact on your life, whether it be for pursuing college degrees, for pursuing a job, for having networking connections. Like, the tangible and intangible effects both are insurmountable. And we have to correct for this with policies that promote equity. Now, of course, the policy of unconditional welfare is not going to solve all of our problems with one fell swoop, but it's going to do a lot of good. So when we take a look at Rawls and his theory of justice, he talks about how inequalities are justified if there is a moral reason for why those inequalities should perpetuate themselves. So when you look at Rawls, there's people who are born into cyclical poverty, especially children, and we believe that those children should not be suffering for the decisions of their parents. Like if your dad makes a bad decision, like does drugs or gets put in prison, like that trickle-down welfare doesn't affect the kid. Like the kid misses out on having a full stomach at the end of the day because of his dad's bad decisions, and we think that's completely unfair. The result here is we have a more equitable policy, and that is completely advisable with the government team's model, an equitable policy that pursues equality for people, that takes only morally relevant factors into account. Third and finally, we're going to talk about how unconditional cash transfers will help alleviate or defray the negative ramifications of inequality. So we end cyclical poverty symptoms because people are inequality, as much as we can try, will continue to exist, but we want to alleviate it. Like if you've been searching for a job and maybe the job market is so bad that you just can't find one in your industry, like you deserve, especially your children deserve the right to go to bed with a full stomach. Like the decisions made by your parents shouldn't impact how you live your life as a kid. You didn't make those moral decisions. But that's exactly what happens today. Your parents' decisions ultimately impact the children, and that is bad because it creates a system where people who don't have a choice in being poor end up poor. So if you step back from the motion at the end of the debate round, the opposition side is likely going to talk about preserving current conditional welfare programs. And we believe that the current welfare programs are not equitable, they promote systemic inequality, and ultimately are completely antithetical to the purpose of their original existence. Thank you.
I would now invite Andy to go to her room.
Thank you.
And now, I would also invite the leader of the opposition to open the opposition bench with a speech not in excess of 7 minutes. If you could just wait for a moment while Annie collects her things, I would appreciate it. Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard from the Prime Minister is a speech that is well-intentioned, and that's commendable. But I think how you're going to want to evaluate this round is which form of welfare actually helps lift people out of poverty, and which one has been historically proven to do this, right? But secondly, you're going to want to evaluate on principle, what is welfare? And we'll tell you a little bit about that. So what am I going to do in my speech? I'll get to some refutation of what they just told us. But secondly then, I'll get to my points about, on principle, why we should do this, how it's been historically effective, And thirdly, how if we do change the current status quo, it's going to lead to a massive political backlash, which is really important now that we have someone like Trump who's running for president. All right, so now let's get into the Prime Minister's speech. We think that on some level they fundamentally misunderstand the history of welfare and the way that it functions. They tell us that like the current existing programs in place were those put in place by Lyndon Baines Johnson, right, in the early 60s. We say that welfare has been reformed a lot since then. One of the primary ways in which it's been reformed is that they've made it conditional. Why? Because they figured out that unconditional cash payments just don't work. But secondly, we would say that one of the biggest reforms that came was that of Bill Clinton in the 90s, and I'll talk about that on my side of the case. But they also say that, for example, people have to be drug tested in order to get welfare benefits. We say that this isn't true. We say that states have tried to do this, and it hasn't worked for them, not this time. And so at the point that this is not any sort of federal requirement, we say that they're fundamentally misunderstanding how the mass majority of people get access to welfare benefits in the status quo. So their first argument, they say that conditional welfare isn't working. We say actually that it has been shown to have marginal benefits. We don't think alleviating poverty is something that you can just make a claim about and say that you do it. We think it's something that's difficult, but we think that what's important is raising the quality of living, but also making sure that that person has an incentive to go and like lift themselves out of that condition. That's what we think we're going to have on our side of the house. Secondly, they make an argument about lottery, but I think again this will be addressed in our arguments about like what the best way is to move people out of a condition of poverty. And then they talk about how unconditional transfers are good because children deserve to go to bed like with a full stomach. We say first of all that the current welfare policies do allow for children to eat food. We think that we have the largest supplemental nutrition assistance program in the developed world. We think that this is something we should be looking to, right? Not this time. All right, now let's get to constructive material. On principle, right, what is the spirit of welfare? We say that welfare is based upon a basic social contract theory that says that someone is willing to benefit someone else if they can show that they will contribute back to society. We say this is the thinking of we will help you help yourself, right? That if someone doesn't demonstrate in any way for you that they're going to get themselves out of a bad situation, that then you would not be obligated as an individual to like give someone your resources. Yeah.
Okay, so if the status quo works and children can, quote, eat food anyway, why is the amount of children dying from starvation increasing every year?
We think that's for a number of reasons. Some of it is people just don't have access to the welfare system. We think that some of it is people who are undocumented. We don't think that your side of the house solves for that. And we say that that's something that we get on our side, which is like reform and include more people in the current system rather than just making it unconditional altogether. So what is welfare actually tied to now? We say it's first to being able to seek employment, not whether you are actually employed. Once you prove that you've actually been to an interview, then welfare benefits continue. We think that this is important because what it shows is that if someone is demonstrating to the rest of society that they're willing to help themselves, then society is more than willing to give them something to help them do that, right? But so secondly, what we say is that like the current welfare system has been shown to be historically effective. This is Bill Clinton in the 90s, right? Where he came together, passed a bipartisan bill that said, let's attach some regulations to our welfare system, make sure that it actually works, because we're losing a lot of money as it is, and poverty doesn't seem to be decreasing. What we saw first was that we saw like this contribute to the budgetary balance that the Clinton administration was able to pass. Why? Because it actually made Republicans and Democrats compromise, which meant they compromised on other things too. So we think politically it was very important. But secondly, we say that because it actually linked people to like seeking employment, that this actually did take people out of the level of poverty, especially once they became employed, those benefits would continue to even further incentivize them more once they were employed. So, like, we think that historically this has been effective. We think they give us no historical examples, and that of LBJ that they do, we think functions for our side of the house because that has been reformed and was shown not to work. Secondly, though, we say this argument of political backlash, that when we pass what they're saying, this is going to look to the right, specifically the extreme right, like a left-wing co-opting of the political system, right? We think that politics functions in a zero-sum game, which is to say that if Republicans win something, Democrats see it as a loss. If Democrats win something, Republicans see it as a loss. This will look like a massive win for the Democrats, and we're not saying that's bad. What we are saying is that Republicans will then act on this, and that will be bad. Why do we say this, right? We think that this will enrage the right politically. Like, right? It will empower Trump and his supporters. In fact, he'll probably say, this is just another example of us losing again to the Obama presidency, right? We think that's something that's harmful, right? But secondly, we say that Republicans right now control both houses of Congress, and they will roll back welfare spending because they have the power to do this. Welfare spending originates generally in the House, and so at the point where Republicans dominate the House of Representatives, they will roll this back, and people will end up, even if it isn't unconditional, getting less money in benefits, and we think that's going to be harmful. But what do we say this does ultimately? We think that this empowers the Trump presidency, number one, and his supporters, but we say that this leads to less welfare overall, but maybe most importantly is that it stalls the agenda of the left. For example, what do I mean? What I mean is affordable college, gun safety, more affordable healthcare, and criminal justice reform, which on both sides of the House we agree should be implemented. There will not be enough political capital on the part of the left to make sure that this happens. Why? Because they will see, the Republicans in both houses will see that they already got through something that they really wanted to do, therefore we are not going to work with them on something else. We think that this is going to be very, very harmful, especially when you consider the current political situation, current political environment, but specifically Republicans dominating both houses. So what have we done in this speech? First of all, I think we've given you a little bit of historical background to show the way in which welfare benefits work now do lift people out of poverty. But secondly, we say that even if you want reform, we get reform. They get a massive restructuring of welfare, which has been shown to enrage people who are politically opposed to that, and those people currently control both houses of Congress. We also tell you that on principle, welfare is something that is linked into the social contract that says on principle that if somebody, right, is contributing to the society, you are willing to help them. If they are not shown to be helping society, then people in that society will not be willing to help them. We think we win on principle, historical effectiveness, and the political backlash that will ensue if their plan is passed. But we also think, most importantly, that the current system in place is far better than what they are advocating.
Thank you very much. Now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to further extend the government bench. Here.
Way. It is our job, it is our obligation to right that wrong. Now, the lens that my partner and I bring to you is the lens of looking at this motion with the point to increase the quality of life through social progress, through social order. And that is why I'll start off with what the purpose of welfare is. My partner did bring up it's alleviating poverty. Now, I would also like to touch on why this conditional policy is inadvisable. Now, it's hard sometimes to disentangle what change has brought about, how to measure that change. However, as always, not everybody gains and loses equally. One line of inequality that has been narrowing and that lies even today is that the reason to expect it will continue to do so is that the old idea of how there's a sharp division between the rich and the poor. And when I say the rich and the poor, I'm talking about individuals, I'm talking about countries, I'm talking on a global level. Worldwide, the number of people living below $1 a day is declining, but the number on less than $2 a day is over 2.5 billion. That is more than 1 person in 3 in the global population. And if we just take a step back and think about that statistics, 1 in 3 people are living under this condition. Now, not only does that say there's inequality, but that directly proves that there's an income inequality, which is why this House believes that that existing welfare programs should be replaced by these unconditional cash offers. To touch on the income inequality, despite the economic crash of 2008 and the recessions, the depressions, and crises that have happened since, the growth in the world's annual economic output continues to outpace by far the growth in the world population. Yet, extreme poverty persists. Till today, extreme poverty persists. I would like to emphasize that because in 2008, 9% of Americans, and even extending this globally, 16% of Chinese people, they felt that they did not have enough money to feed their families. In 2011, 19% of Americans felt like this. Now, obviously, these statistics aren't fraud, right? There's a trend we can see. It's increasing. And if that's not a problem, then I don't know what is, because these numbers are significantly proportional to the problem occurring right now. the Gini Index also shows that the extent of inequality in the U.S., and if you look at it, you can see that there's more than 75% people who feel that there's a direct inequality on them because of the way they're living. So we feel that people born into this privilege, like my partner touched on, is that they still have the right, they still need to contribute to society. We have to focus on the quality of life. And actually, yeah, I'll take your point because this bench does bring up the point of quality of life, which is why we're exactly here to tell you that's what we're going to do.
So until now, your speech has been talking about how inequality exists and it's getting worse. We don't disagree with any of that. Both our sides of the House have the same end goal, to reduce inequality and reduce the fact that it's getting worse. What we differ on is the mechanism that we're going to go through. So when Joe gives you analysis as to how your method creates political backlash, why is he wrong?
Okay, now the problem with this whole idea of why they're wrong is because, like, you're basically saying that we're understanding welfare programs, correct?
Yes.
So, my problem with this statement is that they're actually misunderstanding the intent. We are not misunderstanding welfare programs, okay? This, like, whatever John brought up, that's great. But I'd like to say that they're misunderstanding the intent, and when I say that, I mean that Johnson wanted to end poverty. In fact, he launched a war on poverty. Now, I don't know if, this bench is knows that, or if they're just not agreeing because they agree to disagree. But I would like to prove that actually they go on to quote raising the standard and quality of living is very important. And that's exactly what my bench is here to tell you. We do want to raise the quality of life. We do want to raise the standard of living. We're not here to tell you that cutting these people, giving them unconditional cash transfers will decrease their quality of living. In fact, it'll increase their standard of living. And they go on to say that welfare is based upon, quote, a social contract theory, but they fail to respond to why kids are still dying in that point of interest, why they're still starving. And they haven't even proved why political capital is more important. And what I'm confused about is that they go on to state why our model is wrong, okay? Why our model has several disadvantages. Now, my question, or actually my statement, is that they did not provide an alternative. There is no alternative that we can focus on, or that we can recoup to our model, and which is why this alternative was necessary. Not only that, but why political capital is more important. I didn't get that from the entire bench that went the first half of the bench. I would also like to go on to state, just to recap, why the current welfare programs are not equitable. Because we don't misunderstand it, we actually know they're not equitable. Conditional welfare is an inadvisable policy because we need to understand the long-term benefits. We need to learn from our mistakes. And the side government brings is that model, is the model that is based on justice, is the model that is based on security, and is the model that is based on secure income. And unconditional cash offers. Okay, we're also not stating that we're just going to keep giving them money, regardless of how they spend it and, whether there's disadvantages. Yes, we agree that, giving a lot of money until, they keep going and going is going to be detrimental. However, we are saying that unconditional protected time. We're saying that unconditional cash offers, it's a start. We have to start somewhere. And this is the one step that can lead to progress. We understand that people may misuse money. I'm sure we all have spent money on something that we don't need. We understand that. However, there needs to be a starting point. This is where we start. This is where we give those families, those people, those kids who haven't had opportunities to start somewhere and raise the bar. At least help them in one way possible that we can. And that's not through welfare programs, because we've seen that fail. We need to try something new, and this is why the opening Gov and the entire Gov bench's model will create this problem. We urge you to vote in Gov. Thank you.
Thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister, and now I would like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the top half of this debate. Here.
Mr. Speaker, the fundamental problem with that case is that it tried so hard to make us sound like the bad guys that the previous speaker spent 4 minutes talking about how inequality is getting worse, like we don't agree with it, like we don't want to solve it. The question in this debate isn't about whether inequality is bad or whether inequality is getting worse. It's like a discussion about which side of the house best solves it and uses the best model to solve that inequality. We don't think that either person or either side of this house is a bad person for saying that inequality exists or for proposing a model. We think it's a discussion about who best helps people who are struggling. We say we do, and we think that it was disingenuous for them to characterize it like we didn't understand what the war on poverty was, or like we weren't trying to help. We are. What am I going to do in my speech? I'm going to give you 3 points of rebuttal before moving on to 2 points of constructive material. First in rebuttal is about the argument to the lottery of birth. What we heard from the first speaker and the Prime Minister was that the lottery of birth is bad and that children shouldn't have to suffer for the consequences of mistakes or circumstances that their parents made. We think that that is true. That's why the purpose of welfare is to help these families get out of circumstances that they didn't elect to be in. But moreover, we say 2 things to that. Like, number 1, there are always going to be differences in society depending on which class you're born into. Like, we think those differences are most prominent when you're in the lower class and the distinctions between you and the upper class. But we say that the distinction for someone born into the middle class is exactly the same, right? Like, they're not born into the same equal status that someone from a high-income family is born into. So we say that discrepancies are always going to exist. The question of this debate isn't how to get rid of discrepancies, it's about how to raise the most pernicious of those discrepancies to a livable standard. So we want kids to be eating. We don't think that we can feasibly make every child born into a poor area as rich as everyone born into a high socioeconomic area. The question isn't getting rid of discrepancies or getting rid of the lottery of birth, it's making it so that everyone's society has an acceptable starting point within that lottery. That's what this debate is about. Second point of rebuttal is about political backlash. Joe gave you a significant amount of analysis in terms of sheer time about how the success of a welfare policy is dependent on its political support and the political energy that goes into it. Why is that? As a foreigner, I don't really understand why the political system here is so childish, but he told you that it is because at the point where one party and one side of the House wins, the other side perceives it as a loss regardless of how it affects people in the country. Now, we told you that that was a sad reality of the political system, but one that had to be engaged with if you wanted to help people. And that's going to be expanded on in my substantive material, but it's important to note here in rebuttal that they didn't respond to his point about political backlash even when we brought it up in a point of information. It determines whether or not welfare policy is successful. This debate is about what happens in practice. Third point of rebuttal is about alleviating poverty. We think that the response to this that I'm going to give you right now, at least, is largely a meta response in terms of debate. So what did we hear from first speaker about how they actually alleviate poverty? We think that the links in the analysis they gave us as to why unconditional cash payments are better than conditional payments were largely missing, right? They didn't tell us why they had a problem with every condition we put on welfare. They just seemed to have a problem with the fact that, Mike couldn't get welfare after being in prison 20 years ago. And we would agree with that. We don't think he should be, denied welfare for being in prison 20 years ago. But just because that condition might be something which needs to be changed doesn't mean that every condition on welfare is bad. We support primarily the condition that you need to actively be looking for work and employment because we say that's part of the principle of welfare. So we don't think their case explained the logical links between how they were actually going to get change, and I'll do that in my substantive. I think I've told you enough times that the crux of this debate is who helps people who are on welfare, who creates equality. I'm going to do that through 2 substantive points. Number 1, I'm going to reinforce the principle that Joe gave you about welfare and the spirit in which we give it because we think it was misunderstood and that's problematic. Number 2, I'm going to give you a unique constructive point about how the status quo and conditional welfare ensures efficient spending and therefore gets these people out of poverty. First point on the principle. Before I take that, yes?
So I just want to backpedal to the political backlash point you made. So would you believe that conservatives and Republicans have an interest in reducing the amount of people who get welfare?
No, we don't think that they have an interest in reducing the number of people. If anything, we argue more. But the fact is that, the perception from the right, which is analysis Joe gave you, but I'll go over 10 seconds. The perception from the right is that if you give this money away without demanding anything in return, without demanding that these people try and contribute to society, that's what causes anger, not the fact that you're giving it to more or less people. We think generally we agree that we want to give it to as many people as possible. That's something we should both agree on. So first point about the principle. What did we tell you? The important thing before I start is to note that principled arguments stand independent of what happens in practice. So what did we tell you was the principle? The principle of the social contract was that every member of a society needed to contribute to that society in order to access the benefits that society gives you. What are the benefits? It gives you access to state infrastructure like the police, medicine, and roads and work inside that state, as well as protection from that state. We say the purpose of welfare within the social contract is to say, we acknowledge that right now you're going through a hard time and can't be employed. We acknowledge that you're having difficulty contributing to society, so we will help you for a time on the condition that you will become a functioning and contributing member of society again. So we say that when you remove that condition, and this is also partially a response to that point of information, the fact that there's no guarantee that they will become contributing members of society is what creates the perception that these people are stealing taxpayer money. Even though that might not be true and it's independent of practice, that's the principled argument. That's why they need conditions on welfare to be consistent with the principle of a social contract. No, thank you. Second point, more importantly, about how we alleviate poverty. We think that the status quo and conditions on welfare ensure efficient spending. Our side was the first to talk about the difference between how you spend unconditional cash payments as opposed to the status quo. What is the status quo? We told you that the status quo best helps people put their kids to sleep with a full stomach because it includes parts of welfare which are specifically catered towards buying food, right? The analysis we gave you in the example was SNAP, right? The Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program. The problem with unconditional cash payments is that they are not guaranteed to be used in an efficient way. We don't think that that is always the fault of people who are poor, right? We think that they generally do have an ability to manage their money, but the thing is that they are much more likely to fall for pernicious scams which tell them that if you invest your money here, you'll get a return on it. If you get a loan from this loan shark outside a casino or a dairy, that'll pay off for you. So the problem is that these people are systematically exploited by people who look to make money off them. What happens in the status quo when you distribute that welfare amongst programs that are designed for food and design some of it for cash? It means that you guarantee that that person gets food to put on the table for their child. This side of the House was the only one that engaged with the reality of that situation. So we told you that that is a structural reason why cash payments are always going to be worse than the status quo in terms of welfare. So in terms of the principle, we told you that you need to be willing to contribute to society if you want to reap the benefits of taxpayer money. And crucially in practice, we told you that if you want to alleviate yourself from poverty, you need to focus that money in places where it's going to make a difference, as opposed to being scammed by people who want to do that. We're extremely proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for his remarks, and now call upon the Member of Government to open the bottom half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
I'd like to open up the closing government by asking a very simple question, which is why does poverty exist in the United States? And more specifically, why does poverty specifically target minorities in the United States? Why do people that are minorities specifically find themselves in poverty, specifically find themselves in lower socioeconomic groups, specifically find themselves in poorer areas in the United States? Why do they systemically find themselves in this area? And the pure and clean answer for that, ladies and gentlemen, is racism. The fact of the matter is that the racism that has existed in our society and has been perpetuated for many years, even up until the present day, has led to the systemic impoverishment of minorities in the United States. The first point we're going to bring up today is going to be on the off case. We're going to talk about how having welfare conditions actually fundamentally breeds a disenfranchisement, a lack of agency, and breeds mistrust in our society today. What we are doing when we impose these conditions upon these people is that we are removing agency. We are saying that people that are minorities or people that don't have a lot of wealth in the United States don't actually have the ability to spend their money properly. We don't trust them to spend this money properly, and we assume that they're going to do something other with this money that actually help get themselves out of poverty. Not at this time. In the status quo, what we were really saying is that the poor are somehow less able to make financial decisions, and that an entire group of people in the United States are incapable of making sound and intelligent decisions and are somehow less intelligent simply due to the amount of money they have in their bank account. The impacts of this are, number one, a lower perception of minorities in society. As a result of legislation like this continuing to exist in our society, what we are saying is that minorities don't have the same level of intelligence as other people in our society. We furthermore also prevent these people from escaping the cycle of poverty because these people can never start a business. Instead, they're trapped trying to find some type of job that will support them in order to fulfill these welfare requirements, but as a result of that, they are actually unable to escape the cycle of poverty, which I will get into in my second point. In fact, this can almost be centralized in the idea, especially on the right side of Congress, the idea of a quote-unquote welfare queen. The ability or the idea that that people in welfare would actually sit back, take government money, and not try to actively escape poverty. And this is due inherently to the fundamental belief in the United States by many people that minorities are inherently less intelligent and inherently have the desire to freeload and rely upon government money. Before I move into my second point, yes.
So we were very careful to make it clear that we don't think that these people are in any way less capable of spending their money in the right places, but they are targeted by people who advertise pernicious financial schemes. If you are a single father trying to care for your child, are you not more likely to buy into those schemes?
No, and the very simple thing is, okay, so going back onto their argumentation, I think that it is a pure and complete insult to say that poor people can't understand that their children are hungry. Like, oh, well, instead of like going and feeding my children tonight, I'm going to go and spend this on this weird like scam that this guy like wants to offer me outside of a casino. This is the fundamental belief that leads to racism in the United States, and the opposition in this case continues to perpetuate racism in the United States as a result of this. On to my second point, that of economic mobility.
Before that.
Not at this time. So moving on to the point of economic mobility. Okay. So moving on to the point of economic mobility. So the thing is that if we look outside of the United States, we can actually see how not imposing conditions on welfare and actually giving unconditional money can actually help end the cycle of poverty. Number one, through the ability to start a business, which is actually what the backbone of the U.S. economy relies on, and the main way that people can really find themselves lifted out of poverty instead of being forced to take lower-end jobs in lower-income neighborhoods. And number two, to follow the American dream and to actually have hope, instead of being told that fine, you'll get out of welfare, and then you know what you're going to do? You're going to work a dead-end job for the rest of your life in a low-income community because you weren't put there, but because society put you there and because history put you there. Moving on to examples of exactly how this happens, right? So, for example, I'm sure many of you have heard of the application WhatsApp, right? So the inventor of WhatsApp actually built this $65 million company based on welfare he received that was unconditional cash. He took the welfare money, he invested it properly, he started a business and actually brought himself out of poverty. A second example is Pakistani immigrants in the Australian welfare system, which also provides unconditional cash payments. They ended up starting businesses and actually paid back the money to the government when they had started these businesses and lifted themselves out of poverty. The third example is a long historical example, that of Rome, right? So Rome actually had unconditional bread and circuses allowed for all people so that all people were able to find themselves with food in their stomachs at night. And as a result of that, Rome actually had the highest social mobility out of any empire at the time. Before I move on, yes?
So the whole point of financial scams is that people don't know they're financial scams before they get scammed. The whole concept of predatory loans is that it promises riches to poor people on an absurd interest rate. Why is it not likely that those people are likely to believe that when they're in dire straits?
Right, but the thing is, predatory loans already exist in the status quo, and people already fall victim to predatory loans. In fact, the reason why people get predatory loans is because they don't have money. Because when they have welfare and they don't have enough money to spend without, or in addition to that, they take out loans with the very idea that they can use it to make more money, and that's how they fall victim to these crimes. Moving on to some points of rebuttal. Right, so let's go first into the top half of the case, right? So first things that were brought up were the idea of the social contract, right? So that if we help you, you need to inherently come back and demonstrate your ability through interviews, through various demonstrations of competency as to why you're trying to escape or why you're trying to get out of welfare. So you need to show that you've been to an interview. This again demonstrates the fundamental mistrust that led to this level of racism in the United States. The idea that you need to physically demonstrate that you are working to get out of poverty, and that, of course, stemming from the internal assumption primarily that people who are on welfare or people who are in lower income communities do not have a desire to escape poverty, that they must be forced through some other means in order to escape poverty. This, again, helps perpetuate this level of racism in the United States, which actually helps make poverty worse, because one of the main reasons for poverty was low perception of minorities and deliberate disenfranchisement by the majority. Moving on to the second point, that of political backlash. Okay, so my opponents state that this is going to enrage the Republicans. Good. I think they should be enraged. I think they should have this shoved right up where the sun don't shine. Because the fact of the matter is that if you're going to get angry that we're giving people the right to escape poverty, if you're going to get angry that we're going to allow people to actually have a chance at social mobility, then good, screw you. Moving on to the other point, that of bad spending. So again, all of these points are really pretty much covered by the fact that my opponents really have inherent values that really relate to racism in our society. All of these points as a whole, the idea of political backlash and caring more about that than the disenfranchised people, the idea of a social contract that people need to show that they're going to be working to get out of poverty, all comes from this systemic view that people that are impoverished and minorities in this country are not capable of making these sound decisions. And so in order to help fight that, the only way we're going to get people out of this and the only way we're going to battle racism in the United States is by saying that minorities do have this ability, and therefore I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Thank you to the member of government. Now I would ask the member of opposition to respond with a speech not in excess of 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
team is basically trying to give a man a fish every day and trying to make this into a secure thing. However, we as the government team think that we should actually give the man a fishing pole and teach him how to fish so that he can make a living for himself. And this can come through the welfare programs instead of these unconditional cash transfers that the government team is actually advocating for. Sorry, I think I got that switched up in the intro, but you know what I mean. So first on lines of refutation. First of all, the previous speaker comes up here and tells you this entire rhetoric of racism and minorities, and they're just basically spitting this out at you without actually quantifying and actually linking out the arguments for you. So I'm going to tell you 2 lines of refutation as to why this is fundamentally flawed. First of all, to qualify, you need to be at a certain socioeconomic level. They don't count race into the factor, whether you get welfare or not, and so therefore this no longer becomes a problem of racism. But secondly, even if it becomes a problem of racism, they're disenfranchised in the status quo, and they're screwed in the status quo right now, which means that if we don't stabilize the playing field for them, then it no longer becomes fair. And so therefore, welfare programs need to be in place right now in order for us to stabilize the playing field right now. And so therefore, they can't come up here and claim to solve for all of this racism just by changing welfare programs into unconditional cash transfers. Make them do the link work for you, sure.
Okay, so on your earlier point, that of giving a man a fish, wouldn't giving people SNAP actually be giving people fish? Will giving them the money that they could use to start a business be giving them the fishing pole?
No, it would actually not be it, because if you look to different kinds of argumentation that I'll bring up in my positive matter, I can kind of do the link work for you there. Next, they actually come in here and talk about how we view the poor as a lowly individual because they have bad spending habits. However, we on the opposition side think that just people in general have really bad spending habits, and it's not specifically the poor people as in specific. And so therefore, we don't think that this is actually viewing the poor as lonely. We just think human beings in general just tend to have bad spending habits. Also, their last argumentation about how it enrages the Republicans and we should just shove it up their ass. I'm sorry, but shoving it up their ass actually doesn't solve for the clear delineations that the opening half actually, I think, does a really good job in telling you that different kinds of legislations that need to be passed aren't going to be passed now, and this is actually going to screw them up more in the future. And I'm going to be going on to that more. So basically, the opening half basically analyzes why the unconditional versus the conditional is good or bad. We as a closing want to tell you more about the cash transfer aspect of it and why this is actually problematic in the status quo today. But first, I want to add one more positive matter onto the unconditional nature of the motion in itself. So we want to talk about the utilitarianism of those receiving welfare. So basically, when we look at the welfare program in itself, the government team fundamentally makes this flawed assumption that there's tons of money in the welfare system, and so everyone just gets welfare. You get welfare, and you get welfare, and you get welfare. But that's actually not it. And so when you actually don't put on these conditional statements, then this means that people that actually need this welfare money are not going to get it. Let me put it into a scenario for you. Basically, a 30-year-old man or a female living in their mom's basement is going to get the same amount of money that a single mother who has 2 children to take care of needs to actually spend on their living. So therefore, we can see that when you look at the actual disenfranchised people of low socioeconomic levels, if you switch to an unconditional cash transfer, you're actually screwing them more over by giving them limited amount of welfare funding in itself. When welfare funding is limited, this means that more people are going to get less money in their version of the plan. Now let's move on to the cash transfer aspect of it, and we're going to bring you 2 new positive matters as to why this is going to be fundamentally flawed. First, we're going to talk about the accountable spending aspect of it. Now, opening comes up here and tells you about the whole scam scenario in which that father actually ends up falling into the scam. Now, the closing part of the opposition, we're going to tell you that people just generally have really bad spending habits as a whole. And this is going to be really problematic when you give them into cash transfers and not specific portions like the welfare program does. And we think that putting them into specific portions of the welfare program is actually going to be a really good thing. Basically, if we look to the different kinds of, here's a warrant as to why people have bad spending habits. If you look to the vast majority of people who win the lottery, they end up going broke in a couple of years, which clearly shows that people are just generally bad spenders as a whole. This leads us to 2 different impacts. Now, if they actually run out of money, number one, the family is actually left to die because they don't have any more money left in their bank account to actually feed their starving child. Or number 2, the government actually pulls some other form of money and gives it to them, which actually exacerbates the political capital given by the opening government team. And this actually becomes a worse further issue, because we want to say as a closing half that political capital is really important, especially to socioeconomic statuses, because political capital is really fragile, especially in that of the minority groups. And so once you break that political capital for them, and once you use it all up on like giving these unconditional cash transfers, then this doesn't allow for other movements that allow for more social mobility of the socioeconomic status minorities to actually get access to through legislation in itself. Oh, sure, I'll take your point.
Are you aware that welfare programs are actually used in the black market? Like, all food stamps aren't just used for food. In fact, they're sold.
Sure. Well, this actually further exacerbates my point as to, like, if you give them unconditional cash transfers, there's more likely of a chance that they're actually going to go out and use them to the black market rather than food stamps. Let's move on to my new positive matter about how cash gives off the impression that they don't care. When we look to different kinds of values, when we look to different kinds of values, and when we're just throwing away cash, when we're just throwing cash at people and not allocating it to different things and not giving them this welfare program, this kind of it gives off the impression that we don't care. We can also look to like the Greece example. When Greece was in the debt and they actually just everyone just started like throwing money at them, they said that that's not what they want, and that's actual progress and actual happening and actual change can actually happen, not through just cash being thrown at them. So when we're throwing the unconditional cash transfers at people, it gives off the impression that we don't actually care about these socioeconomic status people. So what have we shown you today, specifically as a closing opposition? We've shown you that those that are receiving welfare, those are actually receiving the brunt of poverty, actually becomes more disenfranchised with the government's motion. And we've shown you that through accountable spending, we can see that the cash transfer aspect of it is not a very good way to go. And so therefore, instead of having unconditional cash transfers, we should still keep the welfare programs that we have in the status quo today.
Thank you very much, member of opposition. I will now invite the government whip to close out the government bench in today's debate. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. And my friends on the left would prefer to keep it that way. You see, they say we won't give a man a fish, but they would steal the entire ocean from underneath their feet because they refuse to acknowledge that now is the time for change. They say that because some people cannot spend money from the lottery correctly, we should let millions of children die in starvation. Let me tell you what's happened in today's debate. On one hand, you have the government. You have the government saying that people have a right to life and equity, that children should not be held responsible for the conditions in which they were born, and that they should be given a chance to succeed. On the other hand, we have an opposition that says that, oh, it's not, the status quo is historically effective, and that, we're helping save lives, which is untrue, by the way, because I asked them, if the status quo is so great, why is the amount of people dying from starvation increasing? And they said, because people don't have access. Yeah, they don't have access because welfare is conditional. Under our plan, we would take those conditions away and we could actually save more lives. Now, one point I really want to get to here is their point about political backlash. They said that, oh no, Republicans would be upset. Donald Trump's face will get more red, Here's the problem. Republicans obviously hate the concept of welfare and poor people. Why can't poor people just buy more money, right? Under a conditional welfare system, they are more likely to take advantage and be corrupt than they would in an unconditional welfare system. In a conditional welfare system, they can say, oh, sorry, you didn't meet criteria 51.2 ABCX. In an unconditional welfare system, they have no excuse to deny poor people and low-income residents the right to a healthy and sustainable lifestyle. So actually, we deal with the government deals with the political backlash component of it as well. Furthermore, the opposition contradicts themselves. First, they have a speaker go up here, I think it was you actually, who said, there's a social contract and we have a social bond between government and people, and then they have another speaker who goes up and says, nope, sorry, utilitarianism, we changed our mind. Those are two completely contradicting philosophies. Utilitarianism would better fit the concept of giving everyone unconditional welfare. So when one of their speakers goes up here and says we need utilitarianism, that's a reason to prefer the government, but you disagree.
So, sir, while it's probably fun to stand and call us racists for 7 minutes, the logic we gave you was that if you enrage the right, it results in concrete harms, and we gave you analysis as to why that's the case.
Okay.
You said you were glad to enrage the right, so are you glad to accept those harms?
Okay, first of all, I'm not calling you racists. You've done a pretty good job of throwing the evidence out there yourselves, number one. And number two, as I've said, Republicans would have a harder time being corrupt and taking advantage of a welfare system when it's unconditional. They can say that they're being called racists all they want, but at the end of the day, it's the government team that helps us prevent Republican backlash through an unconditional welfare system. Now, here's another thing they said, that people can't spend money the right way. When a mother knows that her child is starving, it doesn't matter what her income is. She knows her child is starving, and she knows how to spend money. On the other hand, you have the government team saying people should have a right to treat their children and prevent them from dying. A lot of the argumentation that comes from the opposition is what they call principled arguments, ideas that are independent of practice. Let me tell you this. The deaths of millions of children due to starvation from a broken welfare program outweigh any principled, lofty idea they may throw at you. It simply doesn't matter. Now, one thing they said is that right now, poor people are screwed in the status quo, quote, and I don't really want to use that language. But once again, as you can see, every statement they've given is a reason to vote for the government. They're just in denial about it. They know the system's broken, but they refuse to fix it. Yes?
So when I told you that...
Oh, I was pointing at the girl behind you. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about it on a practical standpoint. If welfare system in itself has a cap, right? So like where is all this money coming from, basically?
Well, I don't know, maybe our $800 billion defense budget that we use to kill people for no reason. How about that? And you know what? She comes up here and asks me, why not be practical? Well, this is the same speaker that said, oh, well, we're never going to address racism entirely, so let's just reject the government case, why don't we? You know, why not just give up preemptively? So the debate can be summarized into this. On one hand, you have people saying that there's a great welfare system that works, even though the Gini coefficient and the amount of starving children in America clearly disprove that. And on the other hand, you have a group of people that are saying we have the right to life and equity. But furthermore, what separates the whip and the back of the opposition from the rest of the whip of the government, the back government from the rest of the debate, is that we've given you clear examples of people succeeding using unconditional welfare. We've shown you an example of the inventor of WhatsApp creating $65 million of capital. Well, what'd you guess? An unconditional welfare system. They have nothing to say to that because it's fact, because it's correct. They have nothing to say to thousands of Pakistani immigrants going to Australia, taking advantage of an unconditional welfare system, and then having so much money from the enterprises they run that they actually got to pay back the government. Isn't that great? No, hold on. And once again, we've even gone further back in history. We've gone thousands of years ago when Rome had the same system of unconditional welfare, and wouldn't you know that they were one of the most socially mobilized, economically mobilized empires at that time. This is a clear loss for the opposition team. This is a clear win for the government team. We've demonstrated that unconditional welfare can change the world for the better. They've demonstrated to you that the system is broken, and I want to end on an oral concession actually made by this gentleman right here, that right now, people don't have access to the welfare system. He admitted that right now, people don't have access. He admitted that because it's true. Because under a conditional welfare system, we have rugged individualism for the poor, and we have socialism for the rich. Let me end on one thing that we said also. Why do poor people have to justify their right to eat? When Wall Street gets bailouts for free, why is it that Wall Street can walk away without any justification, but the people on the street have to make a detailed, argumentative case, probably longer than this entire tournament, on why they deserve the right to eat? They may accuse us of not giving a man a fish. I accuse them of sucking up the entire ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Whip. Now invite the opposition whip to respond and close out the final round of California Cup. You're here.
When there are starving babies crawling around the ground who are born addicted to crack, and and their mother is crying because she can't stop, but she knows she needs to stop, side government, or side opposition, or yeah, government, brings you this idea that the mother should just build a business and somehow she'll make $65 million and escape poverty. What we say on side opposition is, no, that's ridiculous for obvious reasons, and two, the social welfare programs we have in state will, one, allow that money to recover, two, allow social services to come in and make sure that child gets the care it needs. Their solution is, yo, let's just pump some money, throw some cash, and our consciences are solved. We agree with you. Yes, there is a moral imperative, a moral obligation to take care of these people who are disadvantaged. We agree with you that, yes, there are lots of people who are disadvantaged. By the way, numerically, there are more non-minorities than minorities who are on welfare. So while, yes, ratio-wise, it is slightly racist, we say that welfare doesn't discriminate. Welfare is based on your socioeconomic level, not like anything else. And so at the point where one of the closing speakers comes up and says, you're racist for 7 minutes, the other closing speaker comes up and rebuts and gives a 7-minute rebuttal, essentially, and does not provide any substantial new material other than, yo, give them businesses, they'll make $65 million, and your problems are solved. We say nay. We say let's actually create policies that help, and throwing money at your problems hasn't worked now, and it's never worked in the past. What works is sustained economic programs. What this debate has come down to is 3 basic questions of crystallization. The first is, what are the differences between like cash and actual welfare programs? The second is, how do these conditions of welfare affect the overall welfare efficacy in the system? And 3, how are individuals helped on an individual basis? Okay.
Okay, so why don't we just go back to your first point that you brought up just now, when you talked about someone on welfare. Why is the person you brought up on crack? And why are they assumed to be a drug user? This actually stems from the inherent belief of the opposition and the inherent belief that comes out from the side opposition today that people that are on welfare are inherently drug users or inherently criminal, and this is exactly what's led to the situation we have today.
Yeah, so what we find is that, yeah, guess what? Not everyone is the same person who's on welfare. We recognize that. But what we also recognize is that if everyone on welfare had the ability to just create businesses and build themselves out of poverty, they would have done it, because no one likes living day to day with the inability to know where their next meal is coming from, much less their next paycheck, right? And because, yes, there are examples wherein people don't have the ability to do that. There are examples like the one I brought you, which shows how programs distinctively help people who wouldn't be helped by cash infusions. At the point where you want to destroy those programs because you think it's better to throw cash at your problems so they go away, we say, nay, sit down, right? So let's talk about the first point of crystallization. What are the differences between cash and welfare, right? So on our side, what we get, what my partner Andy brings to you specifically, is that cash is difficult to spend well, right? We all have difficulties knowing how to spend our cash. While when you actually have low economic means, it's pretty obvious that you need to get food, right? Like which type of foods to buy, how to make sure everyone in your family gets food for a long, sustained period of time. Making sure you have gas in your car to get to work. These are all things that are important. These are all things that sometimes people can get lost in prioritizing, right? Regardless of how much money you make. We say that because of that, cash is distinctively worse. When you have a program that says, look, here's some food stamps, look, here's some assistance for your gas. At the point where the IRS gave out $1.8 trillion in tax refunds to help people with specific needs, we say, look, that's actually more effective than just giving them a big cash refund, because if we give them a big cash refund, maybe they're not able to spend that money as efficiently as possible. Maybe if we give them discounts and subsidies on welfare programs like we've been doing, then they're able to better get a path to an efficient welfare system. At the point where my partner comes up and she tells you, look, when we have safety nets, they're better. At the point where, if, for example, we cut Medicaid, Medicare, and people go to the hospital, we have either one, people, hey, I'm not going to go to the hospital, I don't need healthcare, so they spend their money elsewhere, and then when they actually need the hospital, either one, you guys say, look, no, too bad, we already gave you money, go away, or two, let's break out our pocketbook and spend some more cash, and I say, how is that efficient? Let's look at the welfare programs we have, look at the fact that they're successful, right? And all we get out of closing especially is this assumption that somehow cash is better. But they don't link it for us. They don't